It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you to Reuters for providing this event this morning. I've just come to the point of having been at the FCA for a year, actually, and it's interesting to reflect that a lot can happen in a year. I go back to last June, towards the end of last June, I was preparing to move to the FCA to take up the role of Chief Executive on the 1st of July last year. And there was an event about a week before I moved which made me realise, of course, how much of my time in my new job would be taken up by Brexit. Our job at the FCA is to, and put it simply, to get on with it, to get on with Brexit, to roll our sleeves up and play our part in implementing the decision made by the people of this country to leave the European Union and what goes with it. So I'm not going to talk about this morning about whether Brexit is a good thing or not. It is a lot of work. It didn't feature in the FCA's business planning as a reality until a year or so ago, so we've had to roll a lot of sleeves up. And what I'm going to do today is really start with a brief overview of what we're doing at the FCA. And then I want to tackle in the main part of my remarks what I regard as a big and very important question. And that is that some of the commentary on Brexit suggests that it must inevitably lead to restrictions on trade, restrictions on the location of activity in financial services, and therefore restrictions on open markets. And the question that I want to address is therefore whether restricting trade is an inevitable or indeed necessary response to Brexit and in the interests of anyone. And I'm going to cut to the chase for a moment because I hope you'll not be surprised to know that my answer to these questions is no, it is not. Open markets in financial services, freedom of location and free trade are important to the functioning of the global economy, while integrated financial markets support economic growth and employment. They reduce the cost of access to financial services by encouraging competition. And I think it's always important to have in mind the commitment made by the G20 leaders at the Pittsburgh summit in 2009. That was obviously a fundamental moment, as many people remember, in the wake of the crisis. And that commitment was to avoid fragmentation of markets, to avoid protectionism, and to avoid regulatory arbitrage. But the sad fact of life is that we can't take open markets, freedom of location, and free trade for granted. My view is that firms should be able to take their own decisions on where they locate, subject to appropriate regulatory arrangements being in place which preserve the public interest. Authorities should not dictate the location of firms, rather we should allow open markets to shape those choices, always, as I say, subject to our ability to achieve the public interest objectives that we've been given by Parliament. There is ample, in my view, evidence that open markets and financial services and free trade can exist safely without common detailed rules and shared regulatory institutions. Consistent outcomes of regulation are what matters, and I'm going to talk a bit about that towards the end of my remarks. So, just to summarise, open markets, freedom of location and free trade in financial services matter a great deal, and they should be preserved. So let me start with a brief description of what the FCA is doing on Brexit. First of all, we're ready to provide whatever technical advice is needed to support the government in the negotiations that lie ahead. Second, we're working with authorised firms here to understand their plans for the future of their cross-border operations into the EU and those coming from the EU to the UK. And third, we're working with the government on the repeal legislation. Now, if you ask the question in terms of our workload, it's the legislation, the last of those three, that is the most significant task because it involves a line-by-line analysis of each piece of EU legislation and rulemaking for which the FCA is the lead regulator. And I can assure you, and I'm sure some of you know from experience, there is a lot of it. Our objective in this work is, with government, to create a clear and functioning regulatory regime on the day that the UK ceases to be a member of the EU, and thus give certainty to all interested parties. In doing so, we will continue to advance our statutory objectives and thus maintain high conduct standards and robust, proportionate and sustainable regulation. As we set out in the FCA budget for this year, while we've sought to absorb as much as possible of the additional cost of doing this work and putting Brexit into effect by reprioritising within our budget and within what we do, we have levied an additional sum, it's actually £2.5 million, to cover the unavoidable extra costs of the resources needed. And that's the resources largely attached to this line-by-line analysis in the context of the repeal legislation. Last, and very much not least, immediately after the referendum, we took a couple of important decisions. The first is that as long as the UK remains a member of the European Union, we will engage constructively in our work with and as part of the European institutions, which for us is primarily the European Securities and Markets Authority, ESMA, and we will continue to implement EU legislation during this period. Second, it's vital that we continue to be an outward-looking regulator, heavily engaged with broader global bodies, including the Financial Stability Board and the International Organisation of Securities Commissions, or IOSCO, as of course it's popularly known. The FCA gains significant benefit from our cooperation with other regulators in Europe and internationally. It allows us to share information, intelligence, and best practice, and to deliver as effective supervisors day to day. A retreat from international engagement would be a big mistake, and we're not about to do that. So having described what we're doing, I now want to move on to the impact of Brexit on financial services. When I hear people sometimes say that firms need to relocate in order to continue to benefit from access to EU financial markets, I do start to seriously wonder. Does Brexit have to mean abandoning the benefits of free trade and open markets and financial services? In my view, it should not. Does it require membership of the single market to get the benefits of free trade with the EU? No, it doesn't. Does Brexit mean abandoning the use of regulatory cooperation to ensure sufficient alignment of standards and outcomes so that open markets can prevail? No, again, it should not. Does Brexit mean we're now saying that even with such alignment, economic welfare, market integrity, and the interests of consumers would be so damaged by open markets in the new arrangement that the only way to be safe is to resort to policies to make sure that firms are in your location or on your patch? The answer, in my view, to that is no, it should not. Brexit should not be conflated with whether or not to have open global financial markets and trade in financial services. The economic and financial cost of losing open markets is too great to be justified and is not a necessary response to the choice of Brexit. Now, to be clear, this is highly relevant to the FCA's objectives, because among other benefits of open markets and free trade is the enabling of healthy competition, which is an important objective of the FCA. So I want to put this now into the context, starting with a bit of history, starting with the last 10 years. The correct and, in my view, determined response to the global financial crisis was to build a strong framework of global standards. The aim of this framework has been to create the institutional and regulatory foundation of financial stability and financial conduct. The G20 and the Financial Stability Board have led the way internationally to embed this new approach, and it is to their great credit, in my view, that so much has been achieved, as this provides firm underpinnings for financial stability. The world does feel very different in that sense. In doing so, the institutional structures that can provide the assurance for international trade in financial services have been strengthened. Now, these structures are not yet complete, but that's not because it's failed, it's because it is not an easy task, and it was always envisaged that it would take time. So it's not off course in that sense, it's very much work in progress. So with these institutional structures being built, it makes little sense to abandon them and seek refuge in restrictions in the name of responding to Brexit. A good, in my view, example of the scope for international agreement to facilitate open markets is the agreement between the US and the EU regarding clearinghouse equivalence. It was in many ways quite groundbreaking when it was agreed a year ago. It took some time to put it into place, but the signs are that it has worked effectively, and it has demonstrated that cross-border regulatory cooperation is perfectly possible. This type of agreement can be backed up by effective joint supervisory oversight, something that's very clearly preferable to the cost and risk that is introduced by a location-based policy. I quite often have it put to me that the UK is, however, a different case from other non-EU countries because it has large and nearby financial markets, and therefore there needs to be a more restrictive outcome for the UK than for other countries outside the EU. I have to say that I don't accept this proposition. Our markets have developed together on the basis of the same rules. It would be a departure from the sound regulatory approach of same risk, same requirements. And in a world of increasingly strong global standards of regulation, it seems to me it's not the right approach to take. Now, I think it's also worth spending a few minutes putting this line of argument into some longer historical context, because it really is a crucial point in my view. There is a fundamental question which has been around for more than 200 years of whether people want to live in an open commercial system and thereby gain from free trade with the rest of the world. The approach in Britain shifted decisively in 1846 with the repeal of the Corn Laws, which led not quite seamlessly to Britain being the strongest advocate and practitioner of unilateral free trade in the late 19th and early 20th century. This was a period in which the benefits of free trade were assumed to prevail largely without question. Interestingly, it was the same story in monetary policy, with the classical gold standard operating without an underpinning of institutional support in the modern sense of the term. Now, as history tells us, that era came to an end after the First World War, as the issue of how to reconcile international forces with domestic public interests came to the forefront. And out of that came a larger role for the state as representing the public interest, with choices then made about the precise form of the institutional structures of the state. And here I'm using the word institutional quite broadly to mean the place in which the rules and constraints of the game of political, economic and social interaction are made and enforced. Now, this shift in the thinking about institutions of the state and public policy has continued until today, with some fluctuations in intensity over time. So that institutions of state matter in representing the public interest. And the FCA is an example of this process at work. We represent the public interest in financial conduct. And our role, alongside the Bank of England and the PRA, is to build and maintain public trust in the stability, safety and soundness and fairness of the financial system. So from the First World War onwards, the development of institutions of state representing the public interest has produced another long-running issue. Namely, what is the correct balance of international and domestic institutions? The most important international institutional structures have really grown out of the Bretton Woods Agreement at the end of the Second World War and the treaties that created the European Union. These were agreements essentially about how to interpret and put into practice the role of the state in terms of the balance of national, regional and global institutional structures. They interpreted the meaning of state sovereignty, and in doing so sought to resolve the tension between the economic interdependence of states and national determination. And as part of that outcome, the European Union has over time been a strong proponent of free trade. And it remains so today. So Brexit does not need to lead to calling into question the fundamental principles of free trade and open markets. It is undoubtedly a very big development, but it should sit within the overall scope of how to arrange the institutions of state to enable trade to happen, while maintaining the public interest in stable, safe and fair financial services. Now, we should recognise that this public interest is not limited to the UK public interest. Why is that? Well, it's probably best, in my view, summed up by the IMF in its financial system stability assessment of the UK, published last year. And the IMF said that financial stability in the UK is, quotes, a global public good. This means that the institutional structures that underpin and preserve the public interest in order to enable open financial markets and free trade should, as they do now, represent the global as well as domestic industry. And put simply, that's what it means to have the world's leading financial centre here in London. So this brings me to the last part of what I want to say, which is, namely, what sort of institutional structure of regulatory cooperation do we need to preserve open markets and free trade alongside Brexit? It's worth, if you don't mind me, I'd like to start with a broad reflection on differences in the approach to regulation between the UK and the EU. In my experience, the UK approach at its best is rooted in strong principles which reflect clear public interest objectives. And these principles are then put into practice as rules which allow for the use of supervisory judgment by the relative authority. That's what we do, that's what the PRA does. I would describe this as using judgment against a framework of rules. It can work well, it is focused on outcomes, But that depends on a very clear articulation by the regulator of the meaning of the principles that are established out of the public interest objectives given by Parliament. And that's what we've spent the last year doing in the FCA with our mission statement. It can, to be fair, work less well when the wrong principles are embedded, which to some degree was the case in the run-up to the financial crisis. The problem, in my view, was not principles-based regulation per se, but rather that the governing principles appear, with the benefit of hindsight, to have been inadequate in terms of prudential requirements, firm governance, and in some areas, fair outcomes for consumers. And in response, in the wake of the crisis, we've had to construct a fresh system with stronger principles, again, in the case of the FCA, as reflected in our recent mission. I would describe the EU approach to regulation as far more one of detailed rulemaking as the means to create harmonisation. The challenge is, of course, different in a union of 28 countries, where there's a risk of divergence amongst the various authorities. And the UK, in a way, out of that comes the tension the UK has always faced of how to reconcile its obligations towards the EU approach with the principles-based approach. Now, I'd say that when you look back in the last 10, 15 years, the rules-based approach and the principles-based approach, you cannot determine which one of the two comes out better in terms of dealing with the build-up of excesses before the financial crisis. So the existence of these two approaches obviously begs the question in the context of Brexit of what institutional framework of regulation could preserve open markets and free trade and financial services. It will, let me be clear, require a strong coordination of regulatory institutions across the UK and the EU. The current system is one of common rules which underpin market access, but where the UK has been able to exercise an influence over the form of the rules through its membership and conduct largely independent supervision to put those rules into effect. Over the years, we've argued consistently, and I think successfully, that the application of rules through supervision should not follow rulemaking in terms of centralisation. In other words, rulemaking in the EU has been centralised, but supervision and the application of those rules is something that remains with national authorities. And I think that is a sensible outcome. I don't think it's necessary to go the extra step in terms of centralising supervisory oversight as a condition of stable open markets. Recently, we have seen some movement in the European Union oversight into the application of rules. So there's a degree of movement on that front. But the point I would draw from that is that there is a basis for the sensible use of equivalence as the basis for market access between the EU and the UK in the future. And of course, it's the basis that the EU uses in its relationships with a growing number of other non-member countries. A key area of this is investment services, shortly to be governed by the new framework under MiFID II and MiFIR, both of which we are implementing in the UK. Here, a firm from outside the European Economic Area will be able to provide cross-border services from outside the EU to professional clients and eligible counterparties within the EU without the need to establish an irrelevant jurisdiction inside the area, provided that the regulatory regime of the other state outside the area is deemed to be equivalent, and in some respects, reciprocity exists. For retail clients, there is some scope to require establishment in some form inside the area, which in my view is a sensible recognition that there are differences between wholesale and retail lines of business. Now, this is an obvious basis for coming up with a general approach to equivalence and mutual recognition across financial services, something that would treat the UK essentially in the same way as other non-member countries. As an example, it would not be the best outcome to adopt a special treatment for the oversight of outsourced service provision arrangements involving the UK and the EU, when there are already arrangements in place which can form the basis of an equivalence arrangement. But clearly in the UK, we have to provide comfort to our trading partners that we do uphold the rules and standards in force. And as I noted earlier when citing the IMF, the UK has every reason to continue to put high standards into practice, as our financial markets are an international public good. So this alone should be a source of confidence that in the UK we do not intend to create a race to the bottom on deregulation, because the stakes are simply too high in terms of the risks to our public interest objectives. Moreover, the UK has been and continues to be prepared to go further in recognition of the importance of the financial services industry. A good example of that is the senior managers regime, which establishes a much stronger form of individual accountability in the UK. We also need to preserve close regulatory and supervisory links with the EU. Looking ahead, strong coordination is a sensible approach to take in order to demonstrate the strength of the system. So what are the key elements of that coordination? Well, I'd point to 4 permanent features: comparability of rules, but not exact mirroring, supervisory coordination, exchange of information, and a mechanism to deal with differences when they occur. I would add to this the importance of transitional arrangements being put in place which allow for a smooth path to the new post-Brexit world. Now, effective comparability of regulatory standards in financial services is not a new idea. It exists around the world today in various forms. Crucially, with the advent of much stronger international standards in the wake of the financial crisis, we are in a better place than ever before to create a strong platform of coordination. Again, this recognises just how far we have come in the last decade in terms of the importance of the public interest in financial stability and sound conduct. In banking, we now have robust prudential standards which are being put into effect rigorously. In financial conduct, there is rapid progress in the important area of coordinating wholesale market conduct. Important because international trade in financial services is, on the whole, concentrated in wholesale markets. And an obvious example of this wholesale conduct is the regulation of benchmarks in interest rates, foreign exchange, and other markets. So maintaining open financial markets should be founded on the authorities agreeing that the standards and outcomes should be observable and thus transparent. As authorities, we all share an interest in being accountable for robustly protecting the public interest. Now, clearly, any such system requires an approach that allows checking and verification that outcomes are equivalent and sustained, and that differences can be resolved without recourse to withdrawing market access. Cooperation needs to be close in ways that not only avoid irreconcilable differences, but also thereby make the commitment to sustained market access credible. Disagreements should be escalated to a mechanism that provides reconciliation. Likewise, we should be prepared to make our supervision more transparent, where appropriate, so that it is always a source of confidence. Exchange of information on an open basis will be important to support this. Now, the good news is that we start in a good place, in my view, in terms of the strength of working relationships between regulatory authorities. We've worked hard on this over the years. As a board member of ESMA, and I was there yesterday, I am as committed to its work today as the FCA was before the referendum. I hope we can all commit openly to keep it this way. No good will come from a breakdown of these relationships, since we are pursuing common public interests. We have built effective structures around supervisory colleges in the EU and globally. And at the FCA, we have over 100 memorandums of understanding with other regulators around the world. We should continue this work with a strong commitment. This is another lesson of the financial crisis that we should not jettison. So in conclusion, arguing that Brexit should not mean an end to open financial markets does not amount to special pleading, in my view. That's not my job. My job is to achieve good financial conduct, which includes the integrity of markets, the fair treatment of consumers, and ensuring effective competition. My counterparts in other countries have the same broad objectives. There's nothing I've seen in Brexit which changes that. Although the repeal legislation changes or will change the legal basis for important parts of our framework, it does not change our objectives. In the 10 years since the financial crisis, we've come a long way in rebuilding financial regulation to serve the public interest of financial stability and good conduct. And the G20 and the Financial Stability Board deserve great credit for leading this work internationally. This provides the institutional structure for trade in financial services. I have no doubt that we can continue to achieve these objectives in a world with Brexit. That may be you might think that's a bold statement, but I strongly believe it. And my view is that if there is a commitment on all sides that the UK and EU maintain substantially equivalent regulatory arrangements in future, that it should not be necessary to restrict open markets and free trade in financial services, and therefore not necessary to limit the freedom of firms on location. And therefore I see no reason why we should sacrifice open financial markets and free trade as an inevitable response to Brexit. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew, for your thoughts. We've got about a half hour, and I know there'll be plenty of questions here, so I will get to those as quickly as I can. Let me just kick us off, though. This is, I think, the FCA's first public pronouncement, if you like, on Brexit and the possible impact. And you know, far be it from me to put words in your mouth, but it came across as rather more, I would imagine, rather more sanguine, rather more optimistic an assessment than many would have expected, especially from this crowd. Do you think that's fair to say?
No, it's a statement of what should be. I'm not going to, I've deliberately eschewed the idea of saying what will happen. You know, there are many views on what will happen, and frankly, that's all in the gift of the negotiations. The reason that I've put it as I do is that because I very strongly believe that if we look at the underlying principles, that Brexit should not be a barrier to free trade. So I have to, don't regard this as a sanguine statement. What it is a statement of where we should aspire to be.
All right. Yeah. Let me just come at this from a slightly different angle. You've talked recently about being shut out from some of the discussions in Europe, ESMA in particular. How hard is it, in your words, to get on with this when you're being shut out?
Oh no, it's not a problem. I mean, I spent about I was there yesterday, and I spent about half an hour out of the room in the course of the whole day. And I've said, and I think it's perfectly reasonable that obviously the 27 and plus the ESMA and the Commission want to have the opportunity to discuss what their arrangements will be after we depart. So that's a perfectly reasonable outcome. And it's a reasonably transparent process. So in a sense, it doesn't concern me.
One final piece from me on the back of what you've just said. How realistic are you being, Andrew? Do you think that future relations can depend on regulatory cooperation when, for example, France is pushing for physical relocation of euro clearing to the EU? Those two don't seem to match for me.
Well, the underlying principle, I think, is that, of course, that there has been for a long time and should be competition, if you like, in where financial services is located. That's fine. What we should not do, in my view, is use Brexit as an excuse to restrict the ability to have open markets and therefore freedom of location. That's a big difference between saying that it's natural and indeed in some ways to be encouraged that there is competition. Now, I think it is helpful that if you take the example of clearing, that the European Commission have come out with a model which allows joint supervisory oversight and therefore is not a pure location policy in the sense of saying you've got to move. I welcome that, and I would welcome. What I hope that will lead to is a sensible and pragmatic implementation. And going back to what I said, what should lie in that sensible and pragmatic institution is the fact that we know enough about how to do regulatory cooperation that we can make that work. That's why I am optimistic.
Yeah.
I strongly believe that if people give us the opportunity, we will make that work.
I did put that word in your mouth.
Don't worry, it's fine.
All right, look, enough from me. I know there are plenty of questions. Let me get to these. What I'll do is I'll group them in threes. Let's grab one there, one from Peter there, and anyone else want to add to this first round? All right, let's just start with these two. Just tell us who you are, where you're from, when you get that microphone. Can we just go in the front row here first?
Oh, yeah, sorry about that, Axel.
Thank you.
Hi, Simon Jack, BBC News. You talked about in your speech about a transition period being desirable. I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit on what that might look like. Some industries are saying actually that transition period should be exactly what we have now until the new arrangements are in place, and that means single market customs union and passporting as we have it now. And secondly, you obviously, banks are filing their plans with you about what their plans, and that deadline is coming up now. I just wonder what you make of that, what you've made of those plans so far, and also what you think the cut-off point is for banks in the political process to have some clarity. When do we need to know stuff?
Yes, well, they're very good questions. If you don't mind, I mean, they actually do. These are two questions that mesh together very closely. So, to some degree, I won't answer them separately, but try to embody them in the same answer. So, the transition period is important. Let me be quite clear on what we're doing in terms of contingency planning, and it's very much the same thing the Bank of England's doing, because we work very closely on this. I always say to people, since we as authorities go around asking firms to make contingency plans for every other known risk that you can think of, and something you hadn't, it would of course be contradictory if we didn't do the same thing for Brexit. So we do. That's a reality, and that's what firms are doing. Where I think it becomes tricky is that there's a very clear risk that, with absent a transition period, firms will hit the point at which they have to start to put into effect their transition plans before they know the outcome of the process of negotiation. That is not optimal, I think, for anybody really, and that's one reason why it makes sense to have a transition period, and it makes sense, I think, all round to have a transition period. Because we're talking here about disruption to markets, which is not just to markets in the UK, because obviously, as I said, the UK markets are global markets. So, that seems to be in everybody's interest to have that. Now, so to your first question, what does that look like? Well, you're right. I mean, what it looks like is to be able to, in essence, continue with the current arrangements while whatever comes next, and obviously, in a sense, I've set out my view in a speech as to what I think should come next, is put into effect. Now, my view is quite clearly what comes next should not look very different to what we have now, but we require some sort of institutional glue to make it work. But that seems to me to be the practical purpose of having a transition period. And I think just to reiterate, I think it would be regrettable all round if we put firms into this position where they feel they're in a bind because they have to do practical implementation of contingency planning before they know the context in which they're going to be working in the future.
Just to piggyback on the back of that, and Peter, I'll come to you in a second, but do you given the time scales and the tight time scales, is there a chance you will cut some of these firms a degree of supervisory slack post-Brexit?
Well, I think the way that, not in terms of the rules, because that's, the rules, the framework of rules is the one we use. If you go back to what I said at the beginning about what the FCA is having to do, one of the things that's quite interesting about the FCA, and I've learned from being there for a year, is that the FCA has to make because of the size of the landscape that we operate on, we have to make a lot more choices in our business plan about what we do and what we don't do. And we have to explain those. And the whole reason for doing the mission, in many ways, is both within the FCA, but also obviously to the outside world, to be transparent about how we exercise those choices. Now, it's inherent in those choices that Brexit obviously is a big influence on it. And so the answer to your question for me would be, well, yeah, it will influence the choices that we make about the things that we focus on in the landscape. And that's why going back to the remark I made about our own position, we took the view early on that we were not just going to expand our operation to do everything plus Brexit, because frankly that's not very realistic. So increasingly, and we'll be working on a new business plan sort of over the summer and the autumn to update the one we published earlier this year for next year. It will be a feature. Of course, it will feature in it. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter Verlassen from Reuters Breaking Views. I had just a two-part question about the 4 areas that you sketched out. You talked about sort of the criteria being a comparability of rules. I just wonder, given that in the current context, the EU makes the rules with UK input, and in the future the EU will make the rules without UK input, does that sort of effectively mean that the UK has to become a rule taker, basically has to adapt to whatever the EU just comes up with? And the second thing is, you talked about a mechanism to deal with differences where they occur. I mean, is that the European Court of Justice? And if not, what do you see playing that role instead?
Well, the answer to the second question really has to be dependent on the outcome of the negotiation. I was not in any sense making a point that it needs to be the ECJ. By the way, actually, as today, most of what I might call the resolution procedures operate way before you get into the sort of formal court structure. So, most of the way in which we sort of sort things out between regulators doesn't involve, we don't take each other to court. So, in any event, in my view, it's not the ECJ, but I'd say I don't presume any answer to that question because it's very much in the, in the realm of the negotiation. I mean, as far as the rule takers point is concerned, I mean, it is an issue. I've said this, I think, before. I think I said it at the Treasury Select Committee some time ago, that of course, I don't want to be in a situation. I don't think any of us want to be in a situation where we become a pure rule taker, and it would frankly make it more difficult to reconcile this. As I described in my remarks, this sort of difference between being a purer rules-based approach and a principles and rules-based approach. So, and the other thing I would say, and at the moment I don't know how we would, I can't give you a sort of, a prediction on how we could solve this, but I think we could. Is, when you look at European law and rules in financial services, I would say, over my experience, there are a few cause célèbres which we all point to and say, I don't like that. So, I've been very vocal on the bonus cap. Mark Carney's been very vocal on the bonus cap. But they are, the exceptions rather than the norm. Much of the body of European rulemaking reflects, I think, the approach taken by successive UK governments over the years, which is, if we're going to get, if this is going to affect us, we've got the biggest financial market, we'd better be in there, shaping what comes out. And that's the approach that successive UK governments have taken, and frankly, successive UK regulatory authorities have taken. And of course, it follows from that therefore, a lot of what's in European legislation and European rules, is consistent. I would say, I can give you reasonable assurance the UK would have done it anyway in some form. Because, as our partners in the EU always say, you guys had your fingers all over this stuff, and they're broadly right.
All right. Yeah, we'll take a question there. Let's do these individually then. Go ahead. Where's that microphone? There
Hi, Kat Contagolia from Politico. So the EU is in the process of considering some rules that would require third country banks to establish holding companies.
Sorry, I didn't catch the last bit.
To establish holding companies function in the EU. That was clearly because they were worried about a lot of branching into the EU from UK groups. And if the opposite were to happen, where a lot of groups were to move into the EU and then branch extensively into the UK, would you consider like a similar approach?
Well, I think, first of all, that question obviously closely involves the Bank of England and the PRA as well. I mean, all I would say to you is at this point, and this goes back to my time as Chief Executive of the PRA, is that we do have today in place a policy for branching from non-EEA countries. The UK has a policy which has been put into effect. And I was responsible for it, and that was done about 2 years ago, so 3 years ago. So, there's a starting point. I mean, I think the issue about intermediate holding companies, of course, I think has far more been an EU-US issue than an EU-UK issue.
Okay, thank you. Yep, next question, please. Yes, lady here, and then we'll come to you. Yeah.
Thanks, it's Caroline Binham.
Sorry, I have to look around the lectern.
I'll peer over. It's Caroline Binham from the Financial Times. We've heard about how some politicians in the Eurozone are wanting to relocate Euro clearing, but also some regulators as well, and the ECB particularly has voiced concern over financial stability risks. What do you make of those arguments?
Well, it's not a new issue, of course. Actually, it was around before Brexit, as well known. Well, I think what I make of it is, just to pick up on what I said in the remarks, is that, of course, the issue is relevant. The financial stability risks attached to, to clearing. If you don't get robust clearing, then you get financial stability risks. And of course, as many people have observed, the response to the crisis, by the way, quite logically, has been to put more, in a sense, into clearinghouses and to make clearinghouses therefore more systemically significant. That was done with eyes open, as it were. But of course, it naturally, and it should do, increases the attention put on clearinghouses as part of the overall system of financial stability. But, as I said in the remarks, there is no reason, in my view, why those risks cannot be managed by supervisory cooperation and oversight. It doesn't require a location policy. We don't have it you don't see it in dollar clearing, for instance. And so as I said a few minutes ago, I think it's a good thing that the European Commission have taken the approach they have. I think it needs to be implemented sensibly and pragmatically. It needs to be taken seriously, including obviously by us as regulators in the UK, which we would do and will do because we do today. And I think, so I think you're very right to point to the risks, but I would say they can be managed. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, right here.
Hi, Sheila Nichol from Schroders. You painted a very compelling picture of where we should be, and I'm just wondering how we get there. And I was particularly wondering whether there is a willingness to discuss these things, particularly among regulators, or whether there is a continuing reluctance because of the reluctance to talk about future relationships between the UK and the EU?
Well, I think that's a very good question. So I think that obviously, we as regulators can't operate independently of the negotiation process. That's clear. So obviously critically, we take our lead from that. It's kind of you to describe it as compelling. I mean, the reason for, in my view, setting out is that I perfectly understand, and in a sense I don't want to appear to be critical of any of the sort of commentary which points to the sort of the bad things that can happen. But I do think it's important that we, given time, and we don't have a lot of time in this process, are very clear on where we would want it. We would want it to end up. I mean, I think it's very important now that we set out what could be. And as I say, what I painted was a picture that doesn't require you to take a view on Brexit, doesn't require you to take a view on single market membership. That I take off the table because those decisions are determined at the political level, and that's done, as it were. But I think that there are the routes exist to come out with sensible outcomes on this. But as you rightly say, I mean, the lead from this, has to come from the political level ultimately.
Yeah, gentleman there, right next to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Alex Merriman. I'm now representing the Personal Investment Management and Financial Advice Association. Quite a mouthful there, PIMFA. Andrew, thanks very much. I want to sort of pick up on some of the points about transition period and rule maker versus rule take, and ask you whether you have a sense of when, I mean, obviously it's subject to how long the negotiations go on, but a sense where there is a cut-off point where you stop being subject to EU standards and the FCA perhaps reverts or starts again doing sort of domestic rulemaking. I want to give you a practical example, which is that of the forthcoming prudential regime for investment firms, which there will be a Commission proposal by the end of this year. If negotiations and council, etc., drag on in the course of next year, you could see that perhaps isn't adopted by the time we UK exit. And the second part of the question is about what you're doing in terms, I mean, of sort of, if you like, ratcheting up the sort of on the global standard side, particularly through participation in IOSCO.
Yeah. No, thanks, Alex. That's a good question. So, our view at the moment very clearly is that we are in the EU. We don't know the outcome of, obviously, of the negotiation, but our approach, and I say this in ESMA, is we are fully involved in the process of both implementing and shaping future regulation. If there were a decision to change that view in the future, that would have to come out of the political process. But until that time, I think it's obviously critical that we are committed to that framework. We have obligations until we leave as members of the EU, obviously. And And I think, frankly, in terms of putting the future framework in place, and to go back to Sheila's point, if we want to get to a compelling future position, frankly, if we popped up and said, well, I'm not having that in the future, and forget that, and we're to be joking, we're not doing that. I mean, that would get the whole thing off on a very bad footing. So we're not doing that. I mean, I'm very clear that we are, constructive and cooperative partners, and in that sense, relationships continue to be constructive. On the IOSCO point, as I said in the remarks, I mean, one of the things that I was very keen on when I arrived at the FCA, and the Bank of England would tell you the same thing, is that, we've always been active players in the global debate, and obviously, Mark Carney's chair of the FSB, so he's the active player par excellence in many ways. But certainly in IOSCO, from our perspective, yes, we have, put more emphasis and said, because, as I said in the remarks, it would be a big mistake for us to become isolationist, a big mistake. So, we fully support the work that IOSCO is doing on various fronts, work very closely with Ashley Alder in his capacity as chairing IOSCO. And we regard that, as I said, as part of the post-crisis global standard setting agenda, which is not only important, as I said, in the context of responding to the crisis, but in my view is also important about where we go in the future in a world post-Brexit.
So redoubling those efforts to interact with the global players would have happened anyway?
Well, yeah, because it's happened post-crisis, but I would say, for me, Brexit has given us another reason why it is important.
Yeah, okay. Gentleman at the back there.
Sorry, Andrew Cameron Penny from Hanover Communications. Very quick question to Simon Jack's initial one. Are you more of a Philip Hammond Teamster or David Davis? Do you favour a short or a long transition if there has to be one?
I'm not going to answer the question in those terms for reasons that will probably be obvious. No, look, it needs to be a sensible period. Now, the challenge in this is that there is, of course, a close interdependency here. The more that we have a framework in the future, which frankly, is based on what we do today, the less you need to have a transition period. Insofar as we can't determine that today, I think it's important there is a commitment to a transition period which effectively achieves the objective of transition, which is frankly a smooth transition, which, as I said to Simon, doesn't trigger this leave firms in this bind saying, well, I've got to now implement my contingency plan because if I don't do it now, I could face a cliff edge at some point in the future, and I don't know where that's going to be, or when it's going to be.
Question of them.
Hi, Simon Jessup, Reuters, Chief Investments Correspondent. I just wondered, once speaking to your colleagues across Europe, how much of an appetite you sense for a tightening in the rules around delegation of asset management activities, and how much of a threat that might be?
Well, I don't think there is per se a desire to tighten rules in the sense of tighten the model that exists today, but I think it's part of the overall framework of making the arrangements work in the future. So delegation is clearly one of the things. It works, in my view, it works well today. It's a model that works well. And there is no reason to disrupt that model, first of all. Second of all, we should be able to come up with the assurance and the institutional arrangements that make it work in the future.
You sent this letter recently to the asset management companies, I think with 30 questions. I forget when the deadline was for them to respond, but that was to better understand their intentions. You said ahead of it. Are you better understanding their intentions?
Yeah. Well,
what's the sense you're getting from them in terms of how they're planning for this?
Well, it's that, and frankly, making sure that we've sort of flushed out all the issues, because going back to my point about the sort of sheer size of the body of rulemaking and law, the devil really is in the detail in this stuff, and obviously we would regret it deeply if we failed to spot things. So the industry is, of course, a very important part of actually helping us to make sure we've covered all the issues, and not just us, but obviously the government understands all the issues. So that's important. Now, out of that, of course, is exactly the same point as I made in the context of other banks and other parts of the sector. Contingency planning is important. It's very relevant to raise the delegation model in that respect.
What's surprised you most about what you've heard from them?
I don't think I've been surprised as such by it. I mean, I think,
Or maybe concerned you most?
well, I mean, as everybody says, this is a lot of stuff to do in a short space of time. Which goes back to Simon's point about the transition period. I mean, this is another reason why we need a transition period, and we need that, in a sense, put in place. Because otherwise, I mean, you're trying to do a very large, a large amount of things in a very short space of time, which, of course, increases the scope for things not to work as you want them to.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Hello, thank you, Andrew. Nicola Baker from BlackRock. You've talked a lot about cooperation between regulators. So a question specifically on cooperation agreements between regulators.
Yep.
First, presuming they're necessary, will the new ones be in place by March 2019?
Well, again, yeah, absolutely, because that's at the heart. And if you take the delegation model, which you're probably referring to there, I mean, it rests on having cooperation agreements between regulators. We have those, of course, but we recognise fully that those are the sorts of things, going back to my point about the devil being in the detail, those are the sorts of things you have to have in place. Now, as I go back to my point about us metaphorically rolling our sleeves up, we'll do it because it's our commitment to do it. We're not going to mess people around in that sense. But it does have to be carefully thought through. And just again, I know Simon's desperate to come back in again, but to use his name again, that's why we do need to have sensible transition as well.
Yeah, really quickly. Yeah. Hold on, what's that?
Oh, Paul, I thought go on. I tried to wrap it all together.
The second part to my question, which was, if you work backwards on your contingency plans from March 2019, clearly you need to start pressing some of these contingency buttons. And I just wonder, at some point you say it's regrettable all round if people have to start doing that, if they but there is a sense that that seems imminent. People will start have to do it. What do we need to know when for people not to have to press the button? Give us a time scale.
Well, I think it goes back to your point on transition. I think.
Yeah, but when will we need to know that before someone who's got prepared the button which they've filed with you, they need to press it pretty soon, don't they?
Yeah, no, it's certainly going to be needed to be known during the course of this year. Yes.
Mm-hmm. During the course of this year. Okay. Anyone else got time for one more very, very quick question, if there's one? Yeah. Rachel, right at the back.
Hi, Rachel Armstrong from Reuters. I'm sure your speech today will have been received very well by most of the industry here. Have you spoken to, say, regulators in France, in Dublin, in Spain about this? Because reports are that they're working quite hard to attract financial firms from Britain, and they're not perhaps focusing so much on improving their cooperation with the UK.
Well, I might go away. I was at the ESMA Board of Supervisors yesterday. So, no, we do have these conversations. And maybe I could just come back to a point I made in the remarks. It is a matter of fact today that there are equivalence arrangements with other countries that are not members of the of the EU. So let's take the United States as a very good example. And of course, they have different systems of regulation. On day one, the intention of the Repeal Act is that on day one of Brexit, the UK will have, in essence, the same system of regulation as the EU. I say in essence only because we have to change some of the sort of the institutional superstructure, because obviously it will be a different set of institutions from the EU, but in substance it will be the same set of regulations. So you have to pose the question, and it's a question that really lay at the heart of what my remarks. If you start there, now you've then got to work out what the sort of what I might call the broad commitment is thereafter, which comes back to some of the other questions. What is the challenge for having broad general equivalence between the UK and the EU? Now, you do get the comment made, but the UK is different from other third countries, a point I again addressed explicitly in the remarks, because it's near and it's big and it's got big financial markets. But I don't accept that point, because it comes back to the answer to Caroline's question, really, which is, we've learned how to deal with these issues in the wake of the crisis through global standards, supervisory cooperation, broad regulatory cooperation. We can deal with these things. We do know how to do that.
very quickly, finally, you know, this industry, the financial services sector, they need rules. You talked about the Repeal Act, the Great Repeal Bill, and we all know how many extra lawyers are having to be brought on board.
I've had to hire them.
to deal with it. Is it going to be done on time?
Oh, well, we have to. I mean, you know, again, we've had, and this is why we've had to gear our operation up to do that very rapidly, because you know, we were faced with having to go through a large volume of regulation and rules, but it's clearly essential.
All right. Andrew Bailey, thank you for coming to Reuters to share these thoughts. Thank you to you all for coming so early on a Thursday morning, and thank you very much for your questions. Andrew Bailey, everyone. Thank you very much.